From the spending bill to the border crisis to the war in Ukraine, this week has been one crisis after another, each picking up speed at an exponential rate. Here to break it down for us all is Victor Davis Hanson, author of The Dying Citizen. Victor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate that. What were your thoughts last night when you saw Zelensky go up there, and at the same time we have the omnibus and we have the border crisis going on? It was multiple issues on one day.
Well, I'll start with the omnibus. I mean, anytime you say that we had no choice, and then the choice ramming through a 4,000-page bill during the holiday season at night in a lame duck Congress, with plenty of warning that they were embarrassed or the Republicans are no different, perhaps in the Senate at least. And when you look at that bill, it wasn't just that what was in it, rewarding the FBI and all of this green stuff and woke stuff, but more importantly, there was nothing in there about the 4 or 5 things people care about. The border, it's going to fuel inflation, and energy. There's nothing about new pipelines or nuclear power or any things we need. And then the other thing is we're $31 trillion in debt. We're running a $1.5 trillion deficit every year. We're up to 123% of GDP, and they're still printing money. This bill and what the other bills that will follow it in this subsequent year, we're going to be paying about $450 billion on the interest. It's going to, I think, federal debt will be financed at about 4.5%. So they live in la la land, and that's true about. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the Ukrainians. They were attacked by Putin. Putin could have attempted to adjudicate that issue, diplomatically. But what me is that with all this triumph, nobody really looks at what's going on in the battlefield, and they've lost 100,000 dead. They keep it quiet, but most of the studies show that the Russians, their economy is ruined. They have 8 million refugees that have left the country, and Putin has a country 30 times larger in area, 10 times larger in GDP, 3 times larger in population. So what I get at is, Allison, we're focusing on all of the weaknesses of Russia and congratulating ourselves that we're winning. But that's not how Putin and the Russians look at it. They look at it something like winter of 1942 when they wore down, and they can do that. And Europe's not with us. We're paying 90% of the tab, and they're back in the Stone Age in Germany, rooms for older people to keep warm. They're cutting down trees, burning wood. They have no natural gas. And so something's got to give. And I don't hear anybody I don't hear Zelensky or Biden say, we're not going to reward Russian aggression, but we're willing to negotiate these borderlands and see of it, at least to talk about it.
Well, and that's the thing. That's what disturbed me about what I was watching last night with Zelensky, is that there was no debate. There was no debate. There was no discussion. We don't really know what our strategic objectives are. And I think it goes to the heart of your book and talking about the voice of the citizen. Because I feel like the citizens do not have a say right now or even understand fully what's happening in this complicated world.
No, they don't. And the thing that bothers me is Vladimir Putin is near 70, and he's not well. He's unstable, an autocracy. And he keeps talking about using nuclear weapons in a way that no one has talked about. He hasn't talked about it before. And so all we get from our side is, this is crazy, he would never do it. And yet he's talking this week about Satan missiles that have a range of 11,000. I know that he's trying this. I know that it's probably bluff, but I don't know that for certain is what I'm saying. I don't know it for 99%. And that's what you need in a nuclear tension. And so Biden just dismisses it. So when he says, we're going to give these $1 billion Patriot batteries, and we know that they have sunk ships of the Black Sea Fleet. They know they're conducting raids inside Russia. They know that we have an advisor. And I'm just thinking, at some point, either they're going to have to remove Putin, that's a possibility, but it's just as likely that the autocracy around him is going to say the United States is de facto at war with us. They've brought, and during the Iraq War and Afghanistan, Russia was supplying, under the cover of darkness, stealthily, probably people in Afghanistan, and we got very angry about it. But I can't imagine the Taliban going to the Duma in Moscow and being, celebrated by the Russians. And so we're doing things that are designed to provoke him, and maybe he won't, but I just don't like the casual attitude about it. There's no debate. And it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but nobody thinks, it would be as if Kennedy and everybody said, oh, we're going to blockade Cuba, no problem. Khrushchev won't do anything. And that we know that we got to a nuclear exchange.
And that's the whole thing. We could be sleepwalking into a hot war right now.
I think we are. We are.
And everyone was just standing there clapping. It was very bizarre. It was very bizarre.
It is. We're right and they're wrong. Okay, I can buy into that. But then you have to tell us, how does it end? So you're going to use what words? If you're Zelensky and the Ukrainians, you know how it ends. If you think that you're going to get every Russian out of Ukraine back to pre-2014, then we know what you need. You need about $400 or $500 billion in supplies. You need to go into Russia and blow up supply dumps. You need to sink the Black Sea Fleet. You probably need to clamp down on a worldwide boycott of Russian goods and services. That hasn't worked. But you need a level of escalation to get every Russian out of Ukraine that is beyond Ukraine's means and beyond our means, unless you want to go to a full-scale war.
I just saw this tweet. Now, Michael Beschloss put this tweet out, okay? He said, for any members of Congress who refuse to clap for Zelensky, we need to know from them exactly why. And so Glenn Greenwald responds, haul them before a committee and force them to pledge allegiance to Ukraine and Zelensky, or else face long-term imprisonment in a supermax. Refusing to clap for a foreign leader on command is a form of treason. And that was the whole thing, is that I think we had a bunch of leaders there clapping, and I certainly didn't understand why they were clapping, and I'm not sure if they understood why they were clapping.
Yeah, I don't know what the strategy was, that right in the middle of a war with Russia, we invite one side to come in and address Congress. And then we're all supposed to, think that there's going to be no reaction from the Russians, or we say this is important to deter China. I understand all that, but what I don't understand is Ukraine. Biden and his advisors and a lot of people in the Republican establishment don't understand there's a complex history with Ukraine and Russia. It's not just Poland. It's not the Czech Republic. It's a former province for most of its history has been part of Russia. And it broke away, and we understand that. And part of the Cold War calculus was it was going to be like Finland or Austria. It was not going to be tied to the West formally. And that's how we got Finland, and that's how we got Austria independent and autonomous. Had one of them into NATO or acted like they were going to come to NATO, or it would have been a disaster. So in realist terms, we're basically telling Putin this former Russian province of the Federation is now firmly in the West, and it's part of the West, and it may or may not be in NATO. It could be. It's going to be in the EU. And it's going to be right on your border, and we're going Western customs and traditions that are antithetical to your dictatorship right on your border, and you're not going to react to it. And I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think he is going to react to it. So, and there's no discussion, as we said earlier, and this is all in the backdrop of this omnibus bill and an open border where we had 5 million illegal crossings since 2000. January of 2021. There's money in the omnibus bill for border security in the Middle East too, but not for us.
And that's the amazing thing about the omnibus bill, is that there is border security money for other places around the world, but not for us. And I was just listening to someone who was talking about the strength of the Mexican cartels and how the Mexican cartels are really becoming these paramilitary forces right now, and they're making so much money at the border, and we are not even concerned about that.
Well, I think the big, yes, and what's even here in California, and I live in a Mexican-American town my entire life, it's 95%. And believe me, most people there are terrified of the cartel. And the reason is that when you have 30 million illegal aliens, you have people who go back and forth across Mexico, but they're working for the cartel. They speak English, their kids in school, and everybody knows who they are. And Northern California and the foothills, goes in the U.S. Park Service or National Forests, you don't go because of fentanyl, meth labs, marijuana cultivation, and they run things. And there's things that are going on with gangs that everybody understands in California. There's a point where you can't pursue them anymore. Or if you're a parent and somebody calls your son a gringo because he doesn't speak Spanish anymore, and this person is in a gang from Mexico, or you object to the police not arresting somebody, that's a dangerous thing. I had a woman in the bank tell me that she was so worried about people coming from Mexico in gangs that she called the police, and they warned her about it. And then she got a call from Mexico on her cell phone, and from a person that said, "We know where you live. We know exactly what you did. I wouldn't do that ever again." And they were calling from Mexico. So I think the story about the cartels is that the number of illegal aliens is so large, and the cartels control the border, that they are now within the United States. And we don't know what to do about it, because they threaten American citizens, American green card holders, and they draft young kids from high school that speak perfect English. And so you get these stories in California that some high school student been here his entire life is working for the cartel.
Oh,
they
yeah.
have so much money. So I don't know how you stop it anymore. It's so deeply embedded within the United States, and they have such powers of corrupting people because of the money, that they're exempt, and no one talks about it.
And that's the whole thing, is I think that normally through their human smuggling operations, they would be bringing in about $5 million a year. Now they are up to bringing in $13 billion a year just off the human smuggling. And so these are really sophisticated operations on the border, and we don't have any money in the omnibus bill.
I think what happens is we have such existential problems in this country with energy, now inflation, but the border, that we can't handle the felony, so we fixate on the misdemeanor. So when you look at those bills, there's woke this and green that, and it's sort of like New York City or downtown Seattle or Portland. They have no idea how to deal with the homeless. They have no idea how to deal with it. Carjacking, or in San Francisco, it's smash and grab. So they fixate on other things. Or Gavin Newsom will tell us, I'm going to outlaw all gasoline cars by 2035. Or then the next week is, you cannot buy any natural gas furnace for your home. And it's of no value, except it tries to suggest to the public they're doing something about irrelevant things, because they can't do anything about the existential fundamental crises. And because they know that to do something about them would be almost revolutionary. It would have to, problems are so out of control now. To control the border, we know how to do it. Trump tried for 4 years, but you would have to build the new wall all the way. We replace 500 miles, but the whole 1,800 miles would have to have it. You'd have to get rid of catch and release. You'd have to tell the Mexican government that you were going to tax all the remittances sent back, 60 billion to Central America and Mexico. You would have to have G status while you'd have to apply for it overseas. You'd have to have diverse immigration, where you said to Europe and Africa and Asia, all of you have as much right to apply for legal immigration as does people in the Southern Hemisphere. And I just don't think we can do that anymore. I think the medicine is believed to be worse than the disease.
Well, I think it goes to the heart of your book when you're talking about the dying citizen. And I grew up at a time where there was a level of patriotism, and you said the Pledge of Allegiance. I can't say all my life I was very patriotic or anything along those lines. However, at this point in time, I think it is a crisis. It is a crisis in this country that children are not being educated regarding our history and the value of citizenship.
Yeah. Well, we saw that because, and I've been a professor for 40 years, and I can tell you that when I started in 1984, the syllabus that I had when I stopped full-time teaching 22 years later was 1/5 of it. And that was in 2005. And now I guess TL were excellent students, but we're Stanford, and I see Stanford students. I cannot believe the decline in the quality of education at Stanford and all of these elite schools. And then, so when you ask students casually, what's D-Day? Blank. What's the difference between the Senate and the House? Blank. What's the difference between early voting, mail-in voting, election day voting? They don't know. They don't know anything. And so they do know that they don't even know what woke is, but they do know that if you say you're woke and you vote you're woke, then that gives you a level of indemnity insurance, so that people will not come after you if you screw up. And this applies to people in the workplace, but they don't know any of these issues. And so when you see these young people on campus saying that this person doesn't have a right to speak and this person doesn't have a right, this is hate speech, and this is a safe space, and you can pick the racial background of your potential roommate in advance, or this dorm does not allow white people to go in, and you try to tell them that this is against the Civil Rights Act of 1965, contrary to the protections of the First Amendment. This is not due process under the 4th, 5th, and 6th. They have no idea. They just know that you have to say this stuff.
And that's all that in your book. I think you point out a couple of very relevant studies. There was a 2017 University of Pennsylvania, it was Annenberg School, and it showed that most people were ignorant of the fundamentals of the Constitution. 37% could not name a single right protected by the First Amendment. Only 1 out of 4 Americans could name all 3 branches of government, and 1 out of 3 could not name any branches of government. While in 2018, the survey from Woodrow Wilson, 75% of those polled were not able to identify the 13 original colonies. Over half had no idea who the United States had fought in World War II, and less than 25% knew why the colonists had fought the Revolutionary War. Meanwhile, the kicker, 12% thought Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded troops in the Civil I'm sorry, in the Civil War. Yeah. And I am going to quote you now. It is harder to lament the loss of constitutional freedoms when the majority of Americans willingly do not know what they are. And I will say I am personally guilty of this, and I'm educated, but it's not something we teach. So how are you supposed to know that you're missing something, or what your responsibilities are as a citizen, or what the value of citizenship is, if you are not discussing history in a way that's meaningful?
Well, you know, I've thought about this, and ultimately, I know it sounds extraneous. It goes back to the School of Education, because that's who teaches the nation's public schools teachers. And when I was a student, I know everybody says when I was a student, but in the 1960s, when I was in first grade, second grade, third grade, every single class we had to learn 5 or 6 songs. So we, God Bless America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, America the Beautiful, the Star Spangled Banner, and we sang them on alternate days. Then we had to, each person every morning had to give a 3-minute, and every person had to give a 3-minute talk. This is in second grade, on what the stars meant on the flag, why you had to take the flag down at night, what would happen if it touched the ground, should you burn it, what happened. And then we had key dates. And so by the time I was in 5th grade, we all had key dates and key people. So all around the room, we had pictures of all the presidents. And then we had the main date. We all knew what D-Day was. We all knew what Gettysburg was. This was 9 or 10. And these were, I went to school with, I would say, 75% Mexican-American kids. The teachers were mostly very poor people that came from Oklahoma during the diaspora to California, the Dust Bowl, and they had key teaching credentials, but they had been taught that their job was to make American citizens and make them competitive and knowledgeable. And I can remember Mexican-American kids coming from Mexico, and we had this class, and they would be fired today. They said, I have a stick shift Chevy. And everybody said, we have a stick shift Chevy. And she said, you'll never succeed in America. That's my duty to make, I want you to speak the King's English. And so we did this, all of us did. We had speech therapists to make, and this was in a rural school. Speech therapists came once a week to make sure that we spoke English. We had to have perfect cursive writing. And it was, I kind of rebelled against it. I thought it was regimented, but it made everybody a citizen. And then we had people come in, and it was almost out of a Capra movie. We had everybody's parents that was an immigrant. Once a year, the guy from Mexico, the guy from Guatemala, the guy from Germany, whatever, their parents came in and they gave us a lecture of how much they loved the United States and how much different it was. And now it's not that we don't do that, but if you look at what the School of Education is doing, then it's the opposite. It's antithetical. It's to destroy citizenship. The last class I taught at Cal State Fresno, I had to get out in the hallway because it was so much noise. And I taught a class in the School of Education just because they had more classrooms. It was on Greek history, and they had made a long row, and everybody in this class, to get their credential, had a little sign on their neck, around their neck, and it said black, white, gay. And then everybody in the row was supposed to, they had to walk through the gauntlet, and then they would say the N-word, or they would say spick, or they would say bitch. They'd all yell, and so everybody understood how racist, homophobic, awful the United States was. And then finally, it was so loud, I'd go out and tell the teacher, you're creating this hatred. I've never heard this on campus. And she said, well, this is what they're going to have to put up with when they go out. I said, no, they're not. You're teaching them how to do that. So the schools of education are the culprit. And the only corrective that I can think of is that we need immediately in these states a nationwide effort to say, you are crazy if you make a teaching credential 1 year beyond the BA necessary to teach K through 12, because they don't learn anything. So why don't you, we're not going to take them on head on, but why don't you just give people the alternative to have a master's degree in English or math and let them choose, just like a JC or community college where you don't need a teacher. And if you were to do that, I can tell you 90% of those kids would walk and want to learn more history or math. They would not want the credential, and that would end it. But they have in a stranglehold, and they're indoctrinating these by what they don't teach and what they do teach. And they do a terrible disservice. And then these schools of education at places like Cal State Fresno or Cal State San Diego, those professors they're only taught with PhDs or EDDs in education. They're taught at Stanford, USC, UCLA, the elite schools. And so it's easy to blame American or the immigrant, or we have 50 million people who were not born in the United States now. So we needed a Marshall Plan to, it's mostly the bi-coastal and for the most part, white and Asian elite who were very privileged, and they're very wealthy. They have high per capita incomes, and they're in the professions, corporations, and their universities are on the coast. And that's where it starts. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley, you name it.
I do want to touch upon the idea of the dwindling middle class, because you're talking about the coasts and the elites. And I think it is so crucial that we take a look at the loss of the middle class and look at it historically. If you're going back to ancient times and you're talking about middle citizens and the Masoi, and I really identified with that in terms of when there is no middle class, and middle class historically, and this is what I'm interpreting from your writings, is that the middle class as a whole makes the best decisions politically. And that's where we should be having these discussions or sending leaders from the middle class to represent us. And now we have this collapsing middle class, which is playing into all of these issues within the country and globally.
Greek writers, especially philosophers like Aristotle, but also poets, they were very, everybody said the middle class is necessary, they never tell us why today, but they did in the abstract and the concrete. And they would say middle class people are autonomous. They work, they have their own home. Rich people tend to want to use their money to gain influence. Middle class people don't have that money, so they can't. Only vote and participate. And poor people are dependent on subsidies, which were very generous in the ancient world. So they're dependent, but the middle people are independent. Then they would say, culturally, a middle-class person is outspoken. They're not obsequious to their superiors, and they're not haughty to their because they're in the middle. And they would give a whole list of things. And it's pretty much what Jeffersonian democracy was about, or Andrew Jackson's revolution. Every once in a while we had these populist revolutions, some of them very good, some of them suspect, but there was this idea that Tocqueville wrote about, that this country was built on the idea of a homestead, a house, a nuclear family, and the ability not to be oppressed economically by the rich, and not to be subservient to government because you were getting a handout. And then when you look at the modern era, until 2018, 12 straight years middle class income decline. It's back declining now when adjusted for inflation. Home ownership had really been going, and now it's down below 60% again. Here in California, it's dismal. And when you look at 100,000 deaths, or you look at what's happened, people don't talk about affirmative action, but this was very important. It went beyond, somewhere in the Obama administration, it was redefined as diversity de facto. So it was not that old 12%, 88% binary that dealt with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, et cetera. It just said anybody who is not white is diverse. So that rubric of victims versus, it was approved at 33 or 4%. And then that said, well, the left said, you know what, we're not going to talk about class anymore. Middle class doesn't matter. The only exploitation is race. So Meghan Markle's a victim, LeBron's a victim, Oprah's a victim. We see this with reparations now in California. But what it really meant, and I was looking at this, and I kind of wrote about it today. But when you look at Stanford University's new class, they just announced it was 23% white, and out of that, 53% are women. So 12% of that class, when that rubric represents 34% to 35% of the population. So Stanford is basically saying, and out of that 12% white male comes legacies, which are about 14% of the total, athletics. And so what I'm getting, and this is true of Yale and Harvard, there are no middle class white kids. There's only very, very wealthy white people and Asians and other people who, who instead, if they can't give $10 million or something to get in, then they have an ethnic angle. And so what we're doing is we're really saying that the middle class is racist, and we don't want it in our elite universities. And what's even funnier is when you hear white privilege, white supremacy, white rage by people like Mark Milley or Joe Biden, you really see that it's kind of a psychological white elite use to shield themselves by fobbing off on some distant middle class person in Bakersfield or Dayton, Ohio, on a forklift who's his real income dropping. He's not able to afford a house, but he is a racist. They even had, and I mentioned in the book, they created a vocabulary for it. Started with clingers and then Hillary deplorables and irredeemables. And Biden really went, semi-fascist. He called them un-American, chumps, dregs. There was a whole vocabulary of disparagement, and we know what's going on. And I can see it at Silicon Valley. There is a hatred of the middle class, especially the white, and it becomes kind of a scapegoat or receptacle for all of the venom against America. They say these people are the domestic terrorists. These people are the January 6th insurrectionaries. And it makes you, it's almost like you're expiated. You don't have to worry if you're a Silicon Valley guy and you're making $2 million a year. If you're Sam Bankman-Fried, he said that. I don't even want to give to Republicans, and I understand that, but we have all of these elites that feel they're exempt because channeled any hatred or woke criticism of them onto a middle class that they never see, they don't know anything about.
I think it's going to be very interesting to see J.D. Vance.
It is.
I think it's going.
Yeah, I do too, because he's not only a populist, and he grew up in part of that demographic, but he's very well educated. He understands how these people think because he was educated with them, and he knows how they have contempt. That's the only group in America, along with evangelicals, that you can publicly disparage in racist terms or in religious vocabulary that's biased, and there's no consequences. And so people just pile on as a way to show they virtue signal their own fides or their wokeness by going one particular group. And
well, I just hope that I hope this week people discuss. You're talking about Stanford with the language, the language guidance. I hope people maybe discuss that over the holidays. Absolutely absurd. It's offensive. And I will say I'm an American as much as I want. That's ridiculous. But you give me so much to think about, and I sincerely enjoyed our conversation today. I don't know if there's anything that I haven't asked you about that you wanted to talk about.
Well, just in closing, I'll just say Stanford had a bad year with Sam Bankman-Fried and his law professor parents on campus. And then we had Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos, who was sentenced. She was a Stanford person. And now our president is under investigation for doctoring, scientific reviews. And then we had these vocabulary things. And then they released the data on the new class they had admitted. And it was not a good year.
All for $80K a year.
Yes. Yeah. Or more, actually, 100,000 with room and board.
Unreal.
Yes.
Well, Victor, you're a treasure. Thank you so much for joining me today. I sincerely appreciate it, and I hope you'll come back soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.